Okay. Welcome, everyone. Please, everyone, take your seats. We're about to start. Okay, hello. My name is Andrew Bavanek. I work at a United Nations Development Program, and I head up our global work on green commodities. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all today to this session, which is part of the stream on deforestation and commodities. We're particularly going to be looking at today the area of the role of the private sector when it comes to commodity supply chains. Very quickly, when we're talking about commodities, what we're referring to in this session are agricultural commodities that are globally traded, that are large volume, such as palm oil, soy, beef, that are highly profitable and occupy large areas of land, particularly in some key producing countries, and are widely recognized to be one of the main drivers of deforestation in certain countries. And so it's an important topic. It's a very complicated topic, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this session today. And as I said, particularly what we'll be looking at is what role can the private sector play? What role can the companies play who are involved in producing commodities, buying commodities, processing and selling commodities? And what we want to be looking at is not just all the good things that the private sector can be doing in this regard, but really taking an objective, analytical look and weighing up both what they can do, but also their limitations, and to be thinking through systematically and systemically what can be done within supply chains and within the way commodities can be produced that can really transform production practices, so that at scale we can be looking at a world where eventually commodities are produced deforestation-free. And I think this is going to be one of the key issues and topics of today's conversation, is not only what we can do at the local level with a few sets of farmers, but really how can we take to scale the concept of deforestation supply chains. So we're very lucky today to have three very insightful, experienced panelists who can help us talk through and think through this subject. They come from various parts of the commodities world, and I think together they're really going to allow us to illuminate the subject and put a lot of the pieces together. Because indeed, I think when we talk about commodities and supply chains, there are a lot of different pieces of this puzzle. We have Darrell Weber on my left, who is the Secretary General of the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, probably one of the most important and well-known commodity roundtables there is. Darrell has been there for a year or two by now. 3, time flies. And has already been showing really outstanding leadership, I think, in the field, and I think will bring a lot of interesting insights from the world of roundtables to this discussion. We have Jonathan Horrell in the middle, who is the Director of Sustainability for Mondelez. Mondelez used to be Kraft, owns many, many companies I'm sure you all have heard of, such as Cadbury, Toblerone, amongst others. Mondelez is the world's largest buyer of cocoa, and I believe second largest buyer of coffee, and a major buyer of the other important commodities such as sugar and palm oil. And Jonathan will be representing the views of Mondelez as an actor on the stage as a sort of a large multinational of commodities. And finally, we have Julia, who comes all the way from Peru for us. And Julia is a senior analyst at the EIA, the Environmental Investigation Agency. And Julia used to be a journalist, but recently has been doing very cutting-edge work in Peru, particularly in the Amazon, analyzing and investigating commodity production and illegal and legal drivers and influences of that production, and particularly has been focusing recently on the palm oil sector. So again, I think will bring us some real insights from the field as to looking at the way companies and also governments are interacting and influencing commodity production, particularly from Peru, which is a country with some emerging and expanding areas of production and palm straight into the Amazon. So those are our panelists. Just to run through the structure for today, I'm going to start with supposed to be one question per panelist, but I've taken the liberty of putting together a few questions for each, which they will have a few minutes each to answer. We will then have a second session, which is a panel discussion, where I have some follow-up questions that will hope to stimulate a debate amongst the three. I'm sure they have various perspectives on the issues. And then we'll end with opening up to questions from the audience for the last 15, 20 minutes. So I hope it'll be a very participatory session, and we'll certainly have time for all of your opinions and questions and comments by the end. So with no further ado, I'll start off. I'll take the panelists in the order they are next to me. So Daryl, thinking about RSPO and Palm, what role can roundtables and certification schemes, and particularly RSPO, play in contributing to reducing deforestation? That's the main question. I have two follow-ups. Can you explain specifically the RSPO criteria for avoiding deforestation and how it is verified? And secondly, considering RSPO covers around 14–15% of globally sold products, so essentially of all the palm oil sold in the world, around only 15% is certified. Can you give your opinions and insights onto how that may pose a limit to the contribution RSPO can play globally in helping reduce deforestation?
Thanks, Andrew, for the kind introduction. Thanks for nice, uncontroversial questions. So, the roles of certification schemes. I guess, in general, to be honest, I saw these questions only yesterday. I'm very sorry, Andrew. But I tried to condense my thoughts in summarize deforestation where it happens. I think deforestation happens in countries either in a structured manner or in an unstructured manner, planned or unplanned. And I think certification schemes play a very significant role where it is unplanned or where deforestation happens haphazardly. Many of these countries have great laws. Unfortunately, these great laws are not enforced. Some of the countries with highest deforestation rates, you'll be surprised to know that their laws are fantastic, but it's not enforced. And this is where I think certification schemes play the biggest role in helping to enforce these laws at a management unit level. And hopefully then inspire government to think about how they, first to reveal to governments that this is a problem, because as you do certification, you will find companies or management units having problems complying with the law. A lot of the times, in my experience, compliance with the laws of the land is one of the biggest hurdles to certification. Second, a lot of times these governments do not understand the ecological impacts of so-called economic development of a crop, for example, like palm oil in a particular area. I know some countries who have not done enough research, for example, on just why is that patch of forest very important. Is it important for water, important for people, or important for wildlife? They have no ideas. And this is where certification schemes like the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil, like FSC and others, they go on the management unit level and then assess and do due diligence. If you want to be a certified member of RSPO, for example, you will have to go on the ground, send your assessors to understand whether these areas are high conservation value or not. These areas, whether these areas have importance to the local communities, etc., etc. So through this way, this helps build capacity to governments as well, because they don't have this knowledge beforehand. Now they do because of certification schemes. And because of that, I think the governments, where they need help, they can then reinforce their laws by adding on this new knowledge that they have. And we've seen this happen in many countries that the RSPO operates, for example, or even where FSC operates. But more importantly, certification schemes adds a level of transparency to activities happening on the ground, which prior to this probably never existed. I'll give you an example. The recent haze in Indonesia, for example, was an excellent example of people knowing there's fires but don't know who's causing them, or why it's happening. And everybody's asking this question. So one of the ways that RSPO played a role is we now, since August, put up all our certified members, the concession areas of all our certified members are now online. And you can see for yourself using NESA data or whatever to see where those fires occurred, were they occurring in the certified members' concessions or not. And that's a level of transparency that until today, we don't know of any other agency doing that in Indonesia. But that's also the level of transparency that certification schemes bring to the table. And that hopefully, we hope, inspire governments and other agencies to do the same for non-members of roundtables. So with all these systems, I guess we do a lot. But one big thing is, even if our systems fail, we provide an opportunity for stakeholders to seek recourse. Without roundtables like us, there is very seldom solid avenues to seek recourse. Of course, I'm the first to admit, with regards to seeking recourse in RSPO, it takes a long time, but we have some success. And I think we're certainly progressing in the right direction in terms of making or expediting this complaint system to a much higher level. So that's on what certification schemes can do. Have I run out of time?
Keep going.
Keep going, good. Now, what does the RSPO in particular, how do we handle deforestation? So in our newly revised standards, we basically say this: avoid high conservation value areas. I can explain in detail later on if you want. Avoid primary forests. Ask permission from local communities. Get free, prior, and informed consent from local communities. And very new to our system is the request, well, the instruction is to avoid high carbon stock areas. So these four things that we ask companies to do prior to, to avoid, in other words. And this is how we define the avoidance of deforestation. With regards to our limit and how do we scale up, I guess, so far I've been talking about the unplanned deforestation or the haphazard deforestation. But some countries do plan for deforestation, especially for palm oil, because it is a very good and very well-known poverty alleviator. It's proven track record. If you compare it with all the other commodities, palm oil brings the biggest return to a smallholder. That's a World Bank study. So countries do plan to deforest. And that's where I think certification schemes have a problem. Because we have these restrictions. You can't go in the primary forests, high conservation value areas, et cetera, et cetera. But we can't go to governments and say, we're going to impose this throughout the land, throughout your country, because this is something you plan for. So I think they see us as the stick, roundtables as the stick, as a punishment. You can't sell your commodity if you break our rules. But they do need the, what's the word? The opposite was stick?
Carrot.
The carrot. That's the word. I forgot the vegetable.
It's what I'm here
the carrot.
It's what I'm here for.
So the carrot. And this is why I'm here today, because I'm keen to hear. I've been following the whole RED discussion for a long time. I have to say I was terribly disappointed after Copenhagen, and I'm hoping for some light. So I do think where countries plan for deforestation, it needs to come with two things, the stick and the carrot, and RSPO or certification or roundtables can be seen as a stick, but they also definitely need a carrot. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Do you have your own mic? Okay, Jonathan. So thank you, Daryl. An excellent start to this, this discussion. So Jonathan, you're next with my sets of questions. So what role do buyers, large multinational buyers such as Mondelez, play in requiring and ensuring deforestation-free supply products? And then as a follow-up to that, how does the issue of leakage affect you as a company, and what role can a company such as Mondelez play with regard to trying to manage the issue of leakage?
Thanks, Andrew. Afternoon, everyone. For those of you that heard me this morning, because I did have a slightly unscheduled trip to the platform early on, I'll try and limit my remarks to avoid too much repetition. One thing I was taken to task for in introducing Mondelez International this morning was that I omitted to mention that here in Norway we make Freya chocolate, which I obviously commend to you very heartily. In terms of the role, so I think in terms of avoiding repetition, I'll probably say less on the role and avoid repeating some of the things I said this morning in detail at least. The question of leakage I think is extremely interesting. Many issues arise from that. But to be clear on the role, we as an end user do not own a single farm or tend to buy directly from. Our role is therefore indirect. I mentioned accountability this morning, and if you wound back 10 years, our procurement functions were focused on a role which was to deliver volume and price of commodity raw materials for manufacturing into products. So that role, in terms of accepting, if you like, acknowledging and trying to leverage our accountability, is something which has evolved, and I think evolved quite rapidly, in relatively recent years. We can set expectations, either in terms of saying that we want to back a particular program or a particular certification to become a member of the RSPO, for example. We've been a major buyer of certified commodities. We're still the world's largest buyer of Rainforest Alliance certified coffee, for example, the world's largest buyer of Fairtrade certified cocoa, and others. But also we can set expectations in terms of principles that we expect to see in our supply chains, and we can, by making them clear, make them known, and therefore start to set an expectation through a supply chain. Directly, we can challenge our suppliers to give us a couple of things, many things, I guess, but including transparency and then delivery against the expectations. And then we can act on the results. We can use the transparency to drive change against our expectations. We're currently in an exercise at the moment around our palm oil supply chain. That will give us some transparency that can help us to focus actions to follow. More broadly than that, we're also members of Consumer Goods Forum, as I mentioned, and from that, the Tropical Forest Alliance. So there are collaborative platforms that we can use as well, but I won't repeat all of that. Something I think does bear emphasizing is that in general, for many of the commodities, certainly the ones that have been mentioned by Andrew at the start, our role is to be part of a wider movement because we can't transform supply chains on our own by and large. There are a couple of notable exceptions where, in cocoa and coffee, we have such a substantial presence that we feel we can, make significant steps in our own right by engaging our supply chain. And so we take the same principles and we do plus on top of that. But for most supply chains, we can't transform them on our own. We need to be part of a wider movement that can transform whole supply chains. We think it's really important that you get systemic change across supply chains as a whole, that we can raise baseline standards, that we don't just focus on the volume that comes to us. And that really leads to, I suppose, the second part of the question, which is around the leakage question. So, why would we not just focus on what we buy? And really, leakage is a large part of that answer. You can get leakage within commodities. There are limits on what you might call segregated supply chains that are developed to specific standards, in that it does nothing for the rest. In palm oil, we're 0.6, I think, % of the global demand, and sometimes we're taken to task for pointing that out because people think we're using that to say, well, it's not our problem. It is our problem, but we can't transform the global supply chain with 0.6% of a % of it. So if we simply, if you like, address our own supply chain, then that leaves the other 99.4% unaddressed. Even if you look at the whole of the European and North American demand for palm oil, that's still only about 15% of the total. So, you know, if you got every single of the best-known consumer goods companies together and all the other users within those end-use markets, you still can't transform that supply chain. So to tackle the problem, you need change across the supply chain as a whole. You also get the issue where you get individual suppliers, in other words, not us as end users, but, you know, companies that we buy from, who might take individual action themselves, and then find themselves isolated if other major suppliers, in other words, their competitors, don't follow. These things create tensions in marketplaces, and those tensions ultimately are unsustainable. So we do need to raise all ships, if you like. Then between commodities, exactly the same principle. You know, fixing one commodity does nothing for the other. There are a couple of very obvious trade-offs. They come to life through the Consumer Goods Forum and the TFA focus. And these aren't examples that are meant to single out, they're just well known. Palm or paper in Indonesia, you know, if you fix one without the other, then we don't fix the deforestation problem. Similarly with soy and beef in Brazil. So we can have major, you know, we can have switching between commodities, which means that solutions need to go beyond those boundaries to avoid that kind of leakage. So that leads you to a point where you have to have some kind of institutional change. And one way of addressing institutional change is through action at a national level, through a mechanism which UNDP support, which is the National Commodity Platform. There's one for palm oil in Indonesia. There was a cocoa platform just got up and running in Ghana last week, and others. And you know, that sort of initiative can reach parts that private initiatives can't reach on their own. We can't address regulation and enforcement of land use. That's beyond our purview. We can expect it to be kind of done, but we can't fix the systemic problems beneath it. And Darryl actually mentioned regulatory gaps as well, or regulatory failings. If a country has good laws but they're not enforced, a national platform could bring all stakeholders together and start to focus on actions that might help to address some of that. We often get issues and challenges within origins around, for example, the tensions between national policy and regional or district policy, and the interactions between them. And so I think that need for broad-based multi-stakeholder institutional change through processes like platforms is something that can really make a difference. I guess we also heard this morning, my final parting shot is that we also heard this morning about the potential for leakage between countries. So we had the question of whether Brazil's initiatives are now spilling over positively or negatively to Peru. I'm not sure a national platform can do that, but I think if we start to build at that institutional level, then we've got a really good starting point.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan. Excellent. All right, so we'll go to our third final panelist, Julia. My question for you. Can you explain the underlying causes of deforestation from palm oil production from your work in Peru? And in doing so, emphasize from your observations what role the voluntary initiatives, such as certification, RSPO, can play to contribute to reducing the deforestation occurring there, and also from your experience, what you see as beyond company influence. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So I have been in charge of EIA's work in Peru for the last 4 years, and which is mainly to document chain of custody for drivers of deforestation, and use this information to promote better governance, policy change, policy reform when it's necessary, or policy implementation when that's what's lacking. We have been working mainly on the illegal timber sector, but in the last year we have been analyzing the palm oil sector. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. Why Peru? Darryl was asking me, how relevant is it, palm oil in Peru? Well, at the moment, it is actually small. We have about 5,000, 6,000 hectares of palm oil plantations in the country, which is small in comparison with other countries. However, the industry is talking about 1.5 million hectares of land which are available for this, and these are Amazon lands. What's the problem with it? Oh, and they claim also that they only need about 125,000 hectares for the local supply, for the local demand, for food and fuel, and all the rest would be for exports. So what's the problem with this? It's not that palm oil plantations are bad per se. I mean, the problem is where you're going to install them and how are you going to work? Are you going to generate or not legal or illegal deforestation, plant or unplanned deforestation? So when we started this analysis in the country, one of the first steps we took was to submit formal requests of information to the national and regional authorities regarding the regulations, the steps, the requirements that the companies have to comply with in order to get access, legal access to land for palm oil. Well, after several months of waiting, we're still waiting. It's not, so one would think that that's a simple question, right? What do you have to do? What are the steps? Who are the authorities you have to go through? But the problem is that at the moment, there is an overwhelming amount of laws, regulations, decrees at the national, regional level that overlap each other, that are not compiled, that are not harmonized, and there are, in several cases, contradictory. And also that come from different sectors. So in addition to unclear regulations, we also have unclear authorities, because for some things, it's the Ministry of Agriculture, for some other things, it's the Ministry of Environment, for some other things, it's the regional governments. We also have a new forest law that should deal with this, but this law was approved 2 years ago, but it's not set in place yet because of the lack of regulations. The government released the first draft of the regulations earlier this month. It has 400 articles, and we're still trying to understand the impact of this at the moment. But this implies that there's a new forest authority that is not in place yet. And nobody knows at the moment how that is going to interact with the regional governments and who's going to have the responsibilities. So that's a pretty big opportunity for unplanned or unwanted deforestation. There's very poor communication between the different sectors about this. The Ministry of Environment has been trying to engage in the discussions with the Ministry of Agriculture with little success. So, and this far, what we have been able to see and to document with our work there is that there are over a dozen requests from private companies for land for palm oil plantations. Normally, they ask for blocks of 10,000 hectares. We have been able to get through the environmental assessment plans, and they acknowledge that it's primary forest. So the investors know that it's primary forest, but they claim that they're also land with agricultural capacity. So we have the satellite imagery that proves that these are intact forests. We have other maps from different authorities in the country that have selected some of these areas to be production forests, to stay like as forests. And still we're seeing that some of these requests